Welcome along to what is now the 6th episode of Forcing Around with Horsepower. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and co-host, Hanno. Hi.
Hi, Krishna. How are you?
I'm well, and this week we're actually talking about the Styrian Grand Prix that just ended a couple of days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And although it was a boring race on the surface, there are actually plenty of talking points, like we're actually going to see later on in this episode.
Yeah.
And as some of you may have guessed from the name of this episode, we're actually going to be doing something a little bit different this week. And actually for the next coming weeks as well, because we're trying out this new format where we are splitting our current episode, as you know it, into two segments, which is the first one is going to be a sort of technical episode, sort of more catered towards the new F1 fan, people who maybe jumped into Formula 1 after watching the Netflix series Drive to Survive, or just happened to stumble upon F1 in social media. And this episode is going to be aimed towards you guys to help you guys better understand the incredibly complicated technical aspects of our sport, and also address the sort of questions that you guys might have as a first-time viewer of a race. And it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. And also for the veteran fans, there's still going to be stuff for you guys to look forward to in this episode, because we're going to be talking about some critical technical talking points, like maybe why Ferrari's race pace is so varied and diverse, going from track to track. And these are all things to look forward to. As our second segment, it's going to be more of the banter, the usual banter stuff, and we're going to be talking about the major off-track talking points, things like driver market rumors, and even on-track events like maybe track limits, like in Bahrain, and the new pit stop regulations is actually what we're going to be talking about in the coming episodes and segments. So do look out for that. And well, for now, I think let's get right into what happened in Styria. So, Hanno, why don't you start us off with what happened in free practice?
Yeah, sure. Okay, before I do begin, I would just like to point out that Max, as some of you might have noticed, isn't here. He is a bit busy for this episode, and we decided that for you guys, we'd try to get our episode out as quickly as possible. So yeah, I'm sorry, Max, but for those of you who miss him, you will get to see him in the next episode as well, as the banter episode that will come out later on in the week or next week. Anyways, going into free practice, going from the French Grand Prix and coming into Styria for the second race of the triple header, we did see a few surprises that were coming along the way and a few expected results. So we're going to free practice 1, where Verstappen, of course, was leading the timings. But then that's where we had a few of the surprises coming in, with Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda coming in 2nd and 5th respectively. Seeing as to how this is the home race for Red Bull and their sister team AlphaTauri, we were expecting them to be a bit quicker, but to be 2nd in the timings for Pierre Gasly and 5th for Yuki Tsunoda, Yuki Tsunoda was just behind Hamilton and Bottas, was quite unexpected and exciting to see, just to see what it would have been like in the race. Free practice 2, even more interesting, because we had Daniel Ricciardo coming in 2nd all of a sudden, and Esteban Ocon as well coming in 3rd, with Fernando Alonso in 4th. This was such a difference from our first free practice, and in a few hours we had Daniel Ricciardo, we had Esteban Ocon, Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel all coming in the top 10, people who we weren't expecting. On the other hand, Sergio Perez came 9th in free practice 2, and in free practice 1, he was actually all the way down in 13th position. So these are people who, once again, were expected to do well, especially after him coming on the podium in the previous race. We were expecting him to carry on this momentum into Styrian Grand Prix, into the home, race of Red Bull. So it was kind of sad to see that happening. Another big talking point was Valtteri Bottas actually spinning out in the pit lane. That was hilarious to watch, because McLaren really milked the content out of it, and they were, with their pit crew helping to push the car around, and on the Instagram stories they were like, "Oh, need a helping hand, Mercedes." So that was a bit funny.
Are you okay, Han?
Yeah, exactly. It was hilarious. But it was interesting to see why that happened, because at such low speed, it's almost impossible, I would say, to kind of lose control of the car, oversteer in Bottas's case. But what happened was, according to Bottas, was that they were trying to actually get out of the pit stops faster, because they felt they were a bit too slow. And because of that, Bottas actually left the pit stop, or began accelerating in the second gear, In doing so, there was actually quite a bit of wheel spin, and that's when he lost the grip and he had a bit of oversteer into, a full donut-ish. So with that, Andres Seidel actually spoke to Marco Masi about how it was dangerous, and it actually was pretty close to knocking out a few of the McLaren pit crew. And because of that, Marco Masi did say that they have noted the incident, and after free practice, Bottas was given a three place grid penalty, which was, I think, was pretty lenient for how dangerous the accident could have been. But
definitely, and actually, you know what? It's kind of ironic thinking that they were trying to avoid or rather minimize wheel spin, leaving the pit box, but they ended up spinning the whole car this time.
Exactly.
So that clearly didn't go their way, and it wasn't the ideal case for Bottas either, because he had shown some good pace, and he's actually won here before.
Yeah.
So for him to have that grid penalty going into the race, I think it definitely impacted him.
It did, I think, yeah. And then going on to Saturday morning, we had Lewis Hamilton actually topping the charts at the very last lap that he put out, which was insane because until then he was kind of complaining that they couldn't find out the difference between their speeds and Red Bull. So I was shocked to see Hamilton actually leading and Verstappen being 0.2 of a second behind, which is quite substantial looking at the free practice 1 and 2 results. So it looked like we might be getting another Lewis Hamilton pole position and Verstappen on the second. But then when we came to qualifying, there was quite a few sad knockouts, I think, in Q1 and Q2. So Jishna, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. And actually Q1, I think, was the first indication of really how closely matched the teams were going into this race weekend. Because if you notice that in Q1, after everyone set the times for the first few laps, you notice that everyone was actually within the 1 second gap from the leader, except for the two Haas drivers, of course, who are sort of in their own championship this year. And it was very close between all of them. And there were instances where we thought that, maybe a McLaren could be on pole, or maybe even Pierre Gasly could be on pole. So it was definitely very exciting. But I think the biggest surprises came from Ocon and Ricciardo, because Ocon actually got himself eliminated in Q1. And that was very surprising to see because Fernando Alonso actually made it further up the grid than him, despite being newer to the team. And I think on F1.com they were talking about Ocon perhaps just not being comfortable with the car, and they also couldn't really pinpoint a reason as to why they were so slow on qualifying. And that really impacted them going to their race.
Yeah, and actually
Ricciardo as well.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick intersection here. I actually read it somewhere that Ocon actually was talking about how he doesn't feel that the performance for the car is there because he feels that he's giving it his all, especially during the qualifying laps. But the lap times aren't just coming, so he actually, as you said, wasn't really feeling happy with the car. So they needed time to, evaluate and understand the problems that they were facing.
Yeah, and it's one thing to, have a problem and then you know what the problem is and you can fix it. But it's another case when you don't really know what the issue is and then you're trying to fix it.
Exactly,
so this week is actually going to be very interesting because they only have 7 days to sort of sort out their issues going into the race weekend. So that's going to be interesting to watch. But after Q1, I think Q2 was actually very interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, again, as you were saying, after having a very, very scary qualifying 1 for Ricciardo, he didn't actually, perform that well in qualifying 2. I mean, especially after being just 0.3 off Verstappen in free practice 2, I was actually looking forward to seeing him coming back and hopefully, even being maybe in the top 3 beginning in the top 3 after Q3. Yeah. But he got knocked out in Q2 because he found himself running out of a bit of track and a bit of room quite often, and that was because he was just trying to carry too much speed into the corners while also keeping up with the minimum speed in the slow corners. And I think that was the problem I think that's the problem that he has been facing consistently. And after the French Grand Prix last week, I was pretty excited to see, because I thought, and I think you did too, Jishno, that he was on a comeback and he was in charge on. But sadly, I think, coming back to a corner with quite a few slow corners coming back to a Grand Prix with quite a few slow corners, actually does seem to be what's the kryptonite for Daniel Ricciardo and this McLaren that he's driving in. He has complained multiple times that his braking has been affected, or at least he's trying to find the correct braking, the correct balance between braking, acceleration, and the grips that are between the tires. So I guess that's what actually caused him to be, knocked out in Q2 again. Very sad, but I guess it do be like that sometimes. But honestly, other than that, Norris pretty well. He did put in the fastest lap. At one point, Perez as well, Gasly, Verstappen. It was very, very, very close at the top.
Yeah.
And even, all the way down to the 10th place, it was very, very close with Russell getting knocked out by just 1,000th of a second. He put in a stellar lap. I think it was the quickest that the Williams has been this entire year so far. Yeah. And it was just gutting to see him go out by that close of a margin. So I do feel for him because he has had some pretty rotten luck for the past 2 years, ever since he got into Formula 1. But yeah, so qualifying 3. What about it, Jishnu?
Well, after seeing Russell's sad departure from Q3, Q3, again, after Q2 was actually very exciting because, at one point in Q2, we had pretty much 4 drivers contesting for the fastest lap. So we knew that maybe Gasly and Norris could eventually, potentially, have a front row start going into the race.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, I guess Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton were just a bit too fast for them. But Norris did manage to put in an incredible lap, just 0.05 seconds slower than Hamilton.
Yeah.
And he got to start on P3 on the grid, following, of course, Valtteri Bottas' penalty for dangerous driving in the pit lane. And a brilliant effort by Norris. But what that left us with was a grid for Sunday, which was Verstappen, Hamilton, Norris, Perez, and then Bottas and Gasly.
Yep. So not forgetting that Yuki Tsunoda also got a 3-place grid penalty.
Yes.
Because he was hampering Valtteri Bottas's hot lap. So he was, for those of you who might not have watched qualifying, what happened was Bottas was actually on his hot lap, and as he was coming into a turn, Yuki Tsunoda tried to get out of his way, but he got out of his way by going straight instead of turning into the corner a bit earlier, and impeding Bottas on the racing line. So even though Yuki Tsunoda was going at a slow pace and allowing Bottas to overtake him, by having done that on the racing line, he did impede Bottas's hot lap, and in doing so, he landed himself a 3-place grid penalty.
Yeah, and actually more on that later, because we're going to be discussing, what these penalties are and how they come into play in a race weekend.
Yep.
And that brings us on to the race actually, because this race, it was a fairly dull race from the outside perspective, in terms of not much on-track action going on. But there's actually still plenty of talking points that we're actually going to be diving into in this episode.
Yeah.
Things like what caused Russell to retire, and what is the DRS train phenomenon that actually prevented overtakes from being made as much as we expected. But let's start maybe right from the get-go. So lights out and away we go, and it was a pretty even start from the top 5, but Norris unfortunately had to go wide into the runoff after coming very close to Perez into turn 1.
Yeah.
But they both had a very good tussle before Norris eventually overtook him at turn 4.
Yeah.
But there are points, where Perez was ahead of him, Norris got ahead for a bit, and then they're switching positions for quite a bit. It was very exciting to see.
It was.
But it must be said, after overtaking Perez back on turn 4, Norris actually held on to P3 for a good 10 or so laps, and that was really promising to see. Because at a point I was thinking maybe Norris could get a second or third podium actually.
Yeah, I was expecting it as well, but I do believe that they didn't make the right call, because I believe that they actually asked Lando Norris to not fight with both Bottas and Perez for the third position, because McLaren did know that they didn't have the pace for the long run to beat both Red Bull and Mercedes for the podium position. And if Norris continued to go flat out to kind of defend against Perez and Bottas, we would have seen what happened in the previous Grand Prix, French Grand Prix, almost again, with the tyre degradation.
And I think what actually influenced McLaren to make that call was actually Ricciardo, their second driver, was actually experiencing a lot of issues with the power unit. And he actually made a great start at the first lap and gained about 4 places going to the first couple of corners.
Yeah.
But after a few laps, he straight away had a power unit issue that meant that all the drivers he had overtaken just sort of breezed past him into the straights. And that was very sad to see, but I think McLaren were probably worried about it. and they didn't want Norris to face that same issue.
Yeah.
Which fortunately he didn't, but it did mean that he had to concede that place to Bottas and Perez. But besides Norris, there was actually more action going on further back, with Gasly getting a poor start that saw him getting sandwiched between Leclerc and Alonso going to turns 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Leclerc had to go off track to avoid colliding with him in turn 1, but he still ended up, colliding to him at turn 2.
Yeah.
The contact between Leclerc's front wing and Pierre Gasly's rear left tyre resulted in a puncture for Pierre Gasly and a broken front wing for Leclerc. And both of them actually came into the pits after that to do a tyre change, do a front wing change. But sadly, Gasly's race actually came to an end over there, because they tried changing the front wing, they tried changing the rear wheels, or rather the whole set of wheels, but they just realized that they had a suspension damage and from the contact earlier, and unfortunately that meant that he had to retire. While Gasly's contact actually meant that he had to retire from the race, for Leclerc, the incident actually didn't seem to have a great impact on him, because he actually had to pit for the hard tyres on lap 1, but he did manage to do some really great stints on both the hards and the mediums to continue into the race and actually end the race in P7. I think he managed to overtake a good 11 or 12 cars going into the whole Grand Prix.
Yeah.
And that was really nice to see. Because I guess that was the only action that was going on in the Grand Prix, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's why he was also voted the driver of the day, because there was only overtaking going on, basically.
And I remember you were complaining because you felt that he was just causing accidents left, right, and center.
I mean, he did cause 2 accidents, once on Gasly in the beginning and once on Raikkonen towards the end.
Yeah.
I mean,
True.
okay, to be fair, they were racing incidents for which penalties wouldn't be meted out. But a driver of Leclerc's quality should have been more careful, so I believe that he should have been penalized for the actions, not once but twice. But I guess beggars can't be choosers in my case.
Yeah, true, fair enough. But I was personally very surprised by Ferrari's race pace, and I decided to read up on it because in France they were actually suffering from race pace. They both started very well on the grid on France, but they ended up falling backwards, so much so that they ended up without any points out of France. But this week they had totally turned that around, and they qualified in a decent place, but managed to make up a lot more positions and actually outscored McLaren in this race. And that's the reason, I guess, for it was sort of work that Ferrari has been doing over the past couple of days on their tyre degradation, because in France that was one of the biggest reasons why their drivers were not able to make up places in the race. And the reason for this is actually down to the circuit characteristics, as Carlos Sainz pointed out, because France is a circuit with a lot of long straights and high-speed corners. And in high-speed corners, when the angle of the corner is very wide, you're sort of dragging the tyres through the corner for the whole distance of the corner. And so what that means is that you're scrubbing the rubber off the tyres for that whole distance. But in Austria, it's a track with reasonably short or long straights. Depends on how you see it. But the turns, more importantly, are not so long as they are in France. And what this means is that there's less scrubbing of the tyre on the track surface. And naturally there's less loss of rubber on the tyre. And so the drivers are able to extend their stint on each tyres. And the lower tyre degradation essentially is what contributes to the race pace difference from France to Austria, which I thought was very interesting, and it made for a very interesting race, certainly.
It did, yeah, and the way Leclerc came back was quite impressive, honestly. And after having abysmal races, from Monaco onwards, I think Baku, even then he started out on pole and then he ended up out of the podium positions. He actually had one of the best races of his careers in terms of the best races of this season in terms of the comebacks that he had, and that does remind me about how despite him making the comeback, Ricciardo couldn't make the comeback because he was stuck in 13th because of the DRS train. That was insane. That happened there. What happened there was because Alonso was just in the points, and they had, I think, about 6 cars fighting for all the way up to P7, the positions.
Yeah.
And, no one could overtake each other because everyone was getting DRS. So essentially, there was almost no difference in the pace for people to overtake each other. Everyone was everyone was punching a hole in the air. Everyone was gaining DRS. So basically, there was hardly any overtaking, which was quite sad because this DRS train did impede Hamilton once, because I believe that once Max Verstappen got out of this, Hamilton actually got caught up in traffic, and he then actually ended up losing out quite a bit of quite a bit of lap time to Verstappen, and towards the end, I think he was about 8 seconds behind when he started out the race with just 1-ish second. And there was a point where he did say that, he didn't understand how the Red Bulls were that much quicker than Mercedes on the straights. Because Mercedes, who were, known for their straight line speeds, are now actually being beaten by Red Bull, who were always known for their amazing downforce package, being able to go on the high speed corners a lot quicker. Even in the low speed corners, they were going quite a bit faster. So it's quite surprising to see how good Red Bull's car development has been this year, how they've managed to adhere to the rules and also work around the floor restrictions that were put about. So kudos to them, I guess. And it's pretty interesting how it played out this race and next race, I guess, because essentially it's the same Grand Prix but just a different name.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And actually, just a quick word on the DRS thing. So DRS is actually a sort of invention, if you will, by F1 to improve the overtaking in the races. And how it works is that basically, if you have two drivers on the track, the driver who is in second place, as long as he gets closer than, as long as he reduces the gap to the guy in front, something less than 1 second, and he's on a straight where DRS is available, in what's called the DRS zone, essentially, the driver gets to flick a switch and the rear wing sort of opens up a bit.
Yep.
And what that does is actually it reduces the drag, and that's what DRS stands for, the drag reduction system. And it basically lets you go faster because not only because of the slipstream effect from the car in front, where the car in front is the one that's punching through the air, but you also have less drag on your own car because of the DRS system. And so that helps you overtake the drivers. But naturally, if you're stuck behind a driver who is a bit too fast for you, then DRS doesn't really have much effect. And unfortunately, in the Styrian Grand Prix, that's what we saw, with Alonso being just a bit too fast for the driver behind him, and subsequently him being a bit too fast for the driver behind him, and so on all the way down to I think 6 or 7 drivers behind them being held up all behind Alonso. So it was really hilarious.
It was.
But another driver who really suffered in the Grand Prix was actually George Russell, as I'm sure you guys may have are familiar with. He had an issue with the pneumatic pressure system in the car, which is what caused him to retire. And if you guys remember, we actually saw him come into the pits, not just once or twice, but I think 3 times it was, to try and fix that issue. And somehow none of it really worked out to him, and they had to retire the car. So what the pneumatic pressure system is basically it's a system that controls the sort of air pressure in the internal combustion engine. And what happens in the internal combustion engine is that basically you get the petrol and you get the air and a spark that causes the energy from the fuel to get unlocked. And of course you need the air in the internal combustion engine to ensure that there is combustion. But when there was an issue with the pneumatic pressure system in George Russell's car, it meant that they were getting poor airflow into the internal combustion engine, and that was actually very dangerous because you're not only risking losing power on the straights and in the corners, but you're also endangering the reliability of the car itself. So it was a wise choice by them to try to retire the car eventually. But they did try and fix it in the pit stops, and how they did it was by bringing in air canisters and air pumps to try and fill up the pneumatic pressure system. Which is not an uncommon sight actually. We've seen drivers in the past suffer from this issue, and usually a sort of a 3 to 4 seconds top up of air in the pit stops can do the trick, and it can fix the issues for drivers. But in George Russell's case, they were unable to fix the issue in the pit stops, and therefore had to retire the car.
Okay, so with Russell being out of the Grand Prix, it was just the latest blow to his series of bad luck that he has been having for quite some time, because I think Sakura Grand Prix was a very, very notable one last year. Then we had Imola. We had Imola Grand Prix where he crashed out with Bottas, which was a very, very debatable one, as Vishnu rightly pointed out back then in our episode. So do check it out if you don't really remember what happened in Imola. But I think with him now, it's just absolutely gutting to see what has been happening to Russell. And I don't know how much patience the guy has, because in his latest Instagram post, he did say that it was very, very sad to see what happened, but the team should raise their heads high because they had a very good package for the car, which they did. But that amount of patience that he has is really commendable.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It was very exciting. It was very nice to see him actually remark to the team radio, or rather to his race engineer over the team radio when he said, it's don't need to say sorry because we win and lose as a team, which is very nice to hear. And it makes me question, because that's actually a line that Mercedes used.
Yeah.
So is he getting how does he feel about the whole Mercedes situation? And we're actually going to be talking about that in our banter episode in the next coming episodes.
Yeah.
So do stick around for that, where we discuss more about not just Russell's contracts, but contracts of other drivers like Perez and Lewis Hamilton. And that's all going to be very interesting. But let's get into the rest of the race, because after George Russell retired, I think for the rest of the race, there wasn't a lot of action besides Leclerc cutting his way through the field, and also, I guess, cutting some front wings in the process. Kimi Raikkonen in particular was a bit unhappy with that.
Yeah.
And I guess what was most interesting was in lap 56, Red Bull actually chose to pit Sergio Perez to try and catch Valtteri Bottas later on with a fresh set of tyres. And it was a very bold call because I remember watching this race with Hanno, and we were discussing, is it going to happen or not? Because there's only like 15 laps left, but he had to gain like about 1.5 seconds each lap. Which is insane. It's a big ask because the track is so small. It's one of the shortest tracks on the calendar. But I was genuinely surprised to see how quick he was on the freshest set of tyres.
Yeah.
At one point, he was gaining like over 2 seconds per lap on Bottas.
He was, yeah. And I truly believe that, he would have caught up to Bottas because he was less than a second away by the time that they crossed the line. And I think he definitely would have come on the podium again if it had not been for the botched pit stop, where his rear left, I believe, didn't come out at first, and it ended up in a 4.8 second pit stop. So I guess what Red Bull was doing was that they were, practicing for the slow pit stops that Mercedes, has tried to cheekily put their way into. What are your thoughts on that?
You know what? I'm gonna say, let's leave that on to another episode, because that's gonna be a lot of fun to talk about with you guys. Because I happen to be the only Mercedes supporter, and it seems like everyone really thinks it's Mercedes' fault, and that Mercedes are trying to desperately slow down Red Bull in this in this strange manner. And,
which they are.
Make sure you guys subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever to listen to that in the next episode, because that's going to be very exciting.
But yeah, so as Jishnu said, we will be discussing this with many pro Red Bull, or more like against Mercedes, with Jishnu being the only Mercedes supporter. So it will be a very, very fun argument, to say the least. So please do stick around and listen to that.
But do also let us know, your comments, your thoughts and opinions on this pit stop ruling by the FIA, because we would love to hear them. Yep,
for sure. So if you have any thoughts, if you leave them down in the comment section, and we do, enjoy them, we will be crediting you guys for your comments in our next episodes. So far, we've had a few comments saying how Abhishek is very hot, which I do agree with, but we would also love to see what you guys think about, any comments you have regarding to the race itself. So do let us know again down below.
And, you were talking about Perez ending his pit stops and having trouble with the pit stop, rather. And at the end of the race, he actually said he would have just needed, half a lap more to get the work done. Because the gap was very, very close down in the end. And I think one of the biggest reasons for this was actually Mercedes didn't really have the luxury of making a second pit stop.
Yeah, they did.
Because Perez was actually a bit too close to Hamilton and Bottas, meaning that none of the Mercedes drivers could risk making a second pit stop and try to catch whoever was ahead of them. And Hamilton, unfortunately, had also used up both sets of medium tyres in qualifying. So, even with a second pit stop, it seems that, he couldn't have caught Verstappen, because Verstappen could have just pitted in for a fresher set of mediums than him, and it wouldn't have made any difference at the end of the race.
Yeah.
And what is interesting was that, after the race, Toto Wolff said that for the first time in 8 years, Mercedes had no weapons in their armory to battle for the win. They didn't have any strategy advantage, they didn't have any tyre advantage, and perhaps most worryingly, they didn't have any power unit advantage. And that just made for a dominant Red Bull win at the Red Bull Ring.
Yeah. It did, and while it was not the best race, which we didn't expect, especially after having Paul Ricard being so interesting, which again we didn't expect. I guess this was our take on the race and the technical analysis for what happened, in the race. Do stick around for our next episodes, where we will of course be having an episode with our featured guests that are Reykjavik, Abhishek, and Rio. If they do come, hop along, you will be hearing from them again and their thoughts on both the Styrian Grand Prix and the Austrian Grand Prix. And apart from that, we will also be diving into the penalties and the floor regulations that FIA made, and also the pit stops regulation that FIA made. So do stick around for those episodes coming out in the future. And that's it for us from now. Thank you for listening in, and do subscribe and like.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.